It was the summer of 1954 when James Turner, a young and ambitious man in his early 30s, drove his prized possession, a 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air, into the Nevada desert. To most people, the car was just another shiny symbol of post-war prosperity, an American classic that embodied the optimism of the era. But to James, it represented more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of his hard work, his success, and his future. James had lived in small-town Nevada for most of his life, but after a few years of working tirelessly in construction, he'd managed to buy the car of his dreams. The Chevrolet Bel Air wasn't just a mode of transport, it was the culmination of everything James had worked for. It was a way for him to prove to everyone and to himself that he had made it. But on that fateful day in 1954, James would never return. On June 12th, James left his home in the small town of Ely, Nevada. He was headed to meet a friend for a weekend camping trip in the Nevada wilderness, a trip he'd been planning for weeks. The road ahead was long, but the Bel Air was built for adventure. It was the kind of car that turned heads and made a statement. As James made his way down the lonely stretches of desert highway, no one could have predicted that it would be the last time anyone would see him. For days, his family and friends grew increasingly worried. The camping trip had been nothing but a distant promise, and there were no phone calls, no messages. James had always been reliable, punctual. His sudden disappearance was out of character for him. By the time a search party was organized, it was already too late. James Turner and his beloved Chevrolet Bel Air had vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was a road of dust and a sense of eerie silence. The search for James stretched for weeks, but there was no sign of him. The Nevada desert, vast and unforgiving, had swallowed him up completely. Authorities scoured the area, but despite their best efforts, they found no evidence of an accident, no sign of foul play, and no clue that would explain his disappearance. His friends, family, and even the police were baffled. James had simply disappeared into thin air, leaving his car, his life, and his future behind. In the months that followed, theories began to surface. Some suggested that James had left of his own accord, perhaps to escape some kind of personal trouble. Others believed that he had fallen victim to foul play, a possible encounter with someone in the desert who had meant him harm. But there were no clues, no ransom notes, no body, nothing. The case soon turned cold. By 1955, with no leads and no progress, the authorities officially declared James Turner missing, presumed dead. For years, the mystery of James's disappearance was pushed to the back of people's minds. His family, devastated by his loss, tried to move on. The car was never found. His name faded from the headlines. And yet, the mystery lingered in the air. What had really happened to James Turner? Had he simply vanished, or had something more sinister occurred? Fast forward to 2025, and the mystery that had haunted Nevada for over 70 years was about to come back into the light. A team of miners working at an old, long-abandoned mine located about 20 miles outside Ely stumbled upon something that would reawaken the decades-old cold case. The discovery would not only uncover the fate of James Turner, but would also shine a light on a hidden chapter in Nevada's history, one that had been buried and forgotten for far too long. What they found deep within that abandoned mine would change everything, and the truth behind James Turner's disappearance would finally be uncovered. But what they uncovered in the depths of that Nevada mine wasn't just the lost car. It was a mystery far darker and more complicated than anyone had imagined. It was a regular Tuesday morning in 2025 when a team of miners working at an old abandoned mine about 20 miles outside Ely, Nevada, made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the quiet town. The mine, once a thriving hub for silver extraction, had been closed for decades, its entrance now overgrown and hidden from view. The workers were tasked with clearing out old debris and equipment, a standard job in the effort to repurpose the area. But what they found that morning was far from ordinary. As they cleared away layers of forgotten machinery, they hit something unexpected, something that felt different from the rest of the rubble. Beneath a heavy layer of dirt and abandoned mining tools, they uncovered what appeared to be a large, rusted object. It was buried deep in the earth, as if someone had taken great care to hide it. At first, the workers assumed it was just an old mining cart or some piece of long-forgotten equipment, but when they got closer, their curiosity turned to disbelief. It was a car, a classic 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air, the same car that James Turner had driven when he disappeared 71 years earlier. The sight of the Chevrolet Bel Air, partially buried and left untouched for decades, was enough to make the miners freeze. They recognized the make and model immediately. The memories of James Turner's mysterious disappearance came flooding back. For those in Ely, the story of James Turner had been a piece of local folklore, a story that had long since faded into the past. But here, in the depths of an abandoned mine, was undeniable proof that the case was far from closed. The miners wasted no time. They called in authorities, and within hours the small town of Ely was buzzing with the news that the Bel Air, once thought lost forever, had been found. What followed was a whirlwind of police, journalists, and local residents eager to know how the car had ended up in a mine, buried 15 feet underground, and, more importantly, what had happened to James Turner. As the authorities carefully examined the vehicle, it became clear that it was indeed the same car James had driven in 1954. The license plates matched, and the VIN, vehicle identification number, was identical to the records of Turner's car. There were no signs of a crash, no visible damage, and no evidence of an accident that could explain its final resting place in the mine. The car appeared almost intact, though the years of neglect had taken their toll. Dust, rust, and decay had claimed the vehicle, but it was unmistakably the Bel Air James had driven out of Ely all those years ago. The discovery raised more questions than answers. How had the car ended up there, deep in an old mine? And more importantly, where was James Turner? Could he have driven the car into the mine and somehow disappeared, or had someone else been involved in the car's burial? Detectives began the painstaking process of investigating the mine site. They combed through every inch of the area, searching for clues that could lead them to the truth. The mine was large, with miles of tunnels and abandoned shafts, but no additional evidence was found to point to James's whereabouts. It seemed as though the car had been deliberately hidden, but by whom and why? Theories began to emerge, each one more puzzling than the last. Some speculated that James had become involved in something far more dangerous than a simple camping trip gone wrong. The Nevada desert was a remote and lonely place where anything could happen, and many believed that James had been the victim of foul play, perhaps caught in a conflict with someone who wanted to silence him. Others suggested that James had been involved in something that went beyond his small-town life, maybe a deal gone wrong, or some criminal enterprise he'd gotten caught up in. But there were other theories as well. Some believed that James had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, something that led him to be targeted by people who didn't want him to live. The Bel Air being buried in the mine could be the result of a deliberate cover-up, the car hidden away to erase any trace of James's disappearance. As investigators examined the vehicle more closely, they found something that added another layer of intrigue to the mystery. A small, leather-bound notebook tucked underneath the front seat of the car. The notebook, though aged and worn, was still legible. The handwriting inside was James's, a collection of thoughts, plans, and what appeared to be notes for a business deal he had been working on. It seemed that James had been planning something that he had kept to himself, and the notebook provided a glimpse into his state of mind in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The notebook was filled with details about meetings James had attended, names of people he had spoken to, and transactions that seemed to be linked to a larger network of individuals. Some of the names were familiar to the investigators, linked to people who had been involved in shady dealings in the region. But it was the last entry in the notebook that caught their attention. Written just days before his disappearance, the final words read, "I have a bad feeling. Someone knows what I'm up to. I'm being followed." This entry sent a chill down the spines of the detectives. James had known something was wrong. Had he discovered something he wasn't supposed to? Had he made enemies who were now determined to erase him from the picture? The finding of the car, coupled with the cryptic notes, deepened the mystery. It was clear now that James's disappearance was tied to something much larger than just a man who had wandered into the Nevada wilderness. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the question remained. What had happened to James Turner? Where had he gone? And who was responsible for hiding the truth for so many years? As the investigation into James Turner's disappearance gathered steam, the deeper the mystery became. The more they uncovered about his life, his plans, and the cryptic entries in his notebook, the more it seemed that James Turner had stumbled into something much bigger than anyone had expected. The discovery of his beloved Chevrolet Bel Air in the abandoned mine had opened a floodgate of questions, but with every new lead, it seemed the answers only created more confusion. The notebook, with its final words hinting at paranoia and fear, was the most telling piece of evidence. "I'm being followed," it said. Those words sent a shiver down the spine of the detectives involved in the case. What had James gotten mixed up in? Who had been following him? And why had his car been hidden so deliberately in the mine, 15 feet underground, after he seemingly vanished into thin air? As the investigation delved deeper into the records and notes James had kept, a pattern began to emerge. The business deals James had been involved in before his disappearance were far more complicated than anyone had realized. The names in his notebook pointed to a mix of legitimate businesses and, more disturbingly, connections to some unsavory characters known to be involved in illegal activities. Some of the individuals he had met with were linked to smuggling operations, others to shady gambling rings operating in the area. It became increasingly clear that James had been walking a fine line, caught between the mundane world of small-town Nevada and the underworld of organized crime. One of the most interesting leads came when the detectives traced a few of the names James had written down in his notebook. One in particular stood out, a man named Leo the Bull Castellano. Leo Castellano had a reputation as one of the most feared figures in Nevada's criminal underworld. He was known for running a series of illegal gambling operations across the state, and his connections stretched far beyond the dusty streets of Ali. He was also notorious for his ability to manipulate people and businesses to his advantage. What raised alarms was the fact that James had met with Castellano only days before he disappeared. The meeting was not recorded, and no one could find a witness who could describe the interaction. But from the look of the entries in James's notebook, it seemed that the meeting had been a tense one. There was mention of a deal that James was supposed to be involved in, but no further details were provided. The mention of Castellano's name, along with James's increasing anxiety in his final entries, suggested that this was no ordinary business arrangement. Something had gone wrong, something that involved far more than just a simple financial transaction. Detectives now began to speculate that James had unwittingly crossed paths with powerful people who were determined to keep their activities hidden. But why would they target him? What did they want from him? And why was his beloved Bel Air buried so deep within an abandoned mine? The answers came slowly, and they came from unexpected places. As the detectives looked deeper into the history of the mine where James's car had been found, they discovered a series of strange coincidences. The mine, which had once been the site of successful silver extraction, had been abandoned for decades. But before it was shut down, there had been rumors of illegal activity tied to the mining company. Some locals whispered that the mine had been used as a secret meeting place, a hub for shady deals that involved people like Leo Castellano and others who thrived in the shadows of Nevada's criminal scene. But the most startling discovery came when investigators unearthed an old map of the mine, showing a hidden section that had never been documented before. It wasn't just the car that had been buried. The map revealed an additional network of tunnels that led deeper into the earth. This section of the mine had been sealed off for years, kept hidden from view. Could it be that this hidden network of tunnels was where the car had been buried? And if so, why? Had James been forced into this part of the mine? Had someone lured him there and then covered up the crime, burying the evidence? As the detectives ventured into the mine's hidden tunnels, they found more unsettling signs that something had taken place there. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to whisper of forgotten history. But in one of the chambers, tucked away from view, they made a discovery that would change everything: the faint traces of a struggle. Small drops of blood hidden beneath layers of dirt suggested that James had not simply disappeared, he had fought back. It was clear that he hadn't left the mine willingly. Someone had forced him there, perhaps even threatened him to make sure he never left. And when it became apparent that the mine had been used for secretive, illicit activities, the pieces started to fit together. Leo Castellano's name was now at the forefront of the EBI investigation. It was looking increasingly likely that he was not just involved in the financial dealings James had been drawn into, he might have been directly responsible for James's death. But the question remained: why had Castellano wanted James dead? What was it that James had discovered or become involved in that made him a threat? And more chillingly, had Castellano acted alone, or had others in the criminal world been complicit in James's disappearance? As the investigation expanded, more information came to light, linking Leo Castellano to a broader web of criminal enterprises across the state. The more they dug, the more it became clear. James had gotten too close to something dangerous, something that not only put his life at risk, but also threatened to expose a much larger criminal network operating in the shadows of Nevada. And in the end, That network had made sure that James Turner would never speak about what he had learned, but the mystery of James's disappearance was far from over. The more the detectives uncovered, the more questions emerged. Where had James been in the days before his death? One of the biggest breakthroughs came when investigators tracked down more of the names in James's notebook. Some of them led to small-time criminals, but others pointed to individuals who had been involved in much larger operations, organizations spanning from Nevada to California and even further. These connections started to suggest that James had unknowingly become a player in a much larger criminal game, one where men like Leo Castellano manipulated, controlled, and silenced anyone who threatened their business. James's notebook entries revealed that he had become increasingly suspicious of the people around him. His last few writings painted a picture of someone who was trapped, caught between the criminal underworld and his own desire for a quiet life. He'd been making deals with people whose names he couldn't trust. The final meeting with Castellano was the tipping point. James had sensed something was terribly wrong, perhaps realizing that he'd been used as a pawn in a much more sinister plan. With his suspicions confirmed, the investigation turned its focus squarely on Leo Castellano. Who exactly was Leo the Bull Castellano? He was more than just a gambling kingpin or a local thug. He had connections to some of the most dangerous and influential men in Nevada, men who were involved in not only gambling, but also smuggling, illegal arms dealing, and even ties to organized crime syndicates in Los Angeles. Castellano had managed to fly under the radar for years, keeping his criminal activities hidden behind a curtain of legitimate businesses. But James had started to see through the veil, and that had made him a liability. What really stunned the investigators was the scale of the operation James had inadvertently stumbled upon. His notebook, combined with his cryptic final words, revealed that there had been a series of secret shipments passing through Nevada, and James had somehow gotten wind of them. What was it that James had uncovered? Was he unknowingly involved in these shipments, or had he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to? It seemed that his disappearance wasn't a random event. It was a deliberate act of silencing someone who knew too much. The detectives soon uncovered that Leo Castellano's reach extended into every corner of Nevada's underground economy. He had connections with corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and even wealthy businessmen who helped launder money through fake enterprises. For James, an innocent man in the wrong place at the wrong time, all of this meant one thing: death. He had learned too much about the network that Castellano and others had worked tirelessly to build, and he'd started asking too many questions. With the discovery of the hidden section of the mine, the detectives believed they were closing in on the truth. The mine had been a place for secretive meetings, and its tunnels were a perfect hiding place. James had likely been lured there, possibly under the guise of discussing business or resolving whatever deal had been causing him anxiety. Once there, however, it became clear that he was in grave danger. The bloodstains, however small, suggested that James had fought for his life. But his resistance had been futile. He had been overpowered, likely killed, and his body hidden away, buried deep in the earth along with his car. But one question still loomed large: who had been the final person to give the orders? Leo Castellano was the obvious suspect, but the more the detectives dug, the more they realized that his network was a well-oiled machine of deceit, with many hands working behind the scenes. Was Castellano acting alone, or had there been other figures in this operation, other criminals who had played a role in the disappearance of James Turner? The detectives began to piece together the final chapter of this mystery. They tracked down more of the people who had been involved in the same criminal circles as Castellano, and found connections to other high-profile crimes in the area, some of which were still unsolved. It became evident that James Turner's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of silencing those who threatened the stability of a sprawling criminal empire. And James, for all his ambition and hard work, had been one of those threats. As they put together the final pieces, the detectives began to suspect that the mine wasn't just a place of burial. It was a place of power, a symbol of control in a dark world where people like James Turner had no place. It was clear now, James had become a casualty in a larger game, one played by men who thought they could control everything and everyone around them. With the truth now emerging, the detectives were left to consider the implications of their findings. The quiet town of Ely had been rocked by the discovery of the car, and now, as the web of criminal activity unraveled before their eyes, they were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that there were still powerful men who would go to any lengths to keep their secrets buried. Even though James Turner had been silenced for over 70 years, the echoes of his life and his death were now shaking the foundations of a criminal empire that had thought itself untouchable. The question that now remained was whether justice could ever truly be served. Would the men responsible for his death finally face retribution, or would they remain hidden behind layers of lies and corruption? The discovery of James Turner's car in that Nevada mine had set the stage for a reckoning. But would it be enough to bring down the criminals who had orchestrated his disappearance? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. James Turner's legacy, buried for decades, was no longer a mystery. The truth was coming to light, and with it, the dark world that had once consumed him was beginning to unravel. As the investigation into James Turner's disappearance continued, it was clear that the revelations were only growing darker. Every piece of evidence uncovered pointed to a web of corruption so deep that it stretched far beyond Nevada's borders. The miners' discovery of the Chevrolet Bel Air, buried 15 feet underground in the abandoned mine, was the key that unlocked decades of silence. Yet, the questions were piling up faster than the answers. With Leo Castellano's involvement now firmly at the center of the investigation, the detectives knew they had to act quickly. His criminal network was vast, and if anyone had the power to cover up a murder as carefully as this one, it was him. But even Castellano, a man who had evaded the law for so long, wasn't untouchable. As the detectives dug into his connections, they found something even more disturbing than they had imagined. Castellano was not just a gambler and a local thug, he was part of a much bigger operation that reached the highest echelons of organized crime. The connections James had inadvertently uncovered were part of a national conspiracy that involved several mafia families across the country. What had started as a small-town tragedy was now a key event in a much larger, more dangerous game. James had unknowingly gotten mixed up in this web, and it had cost him his life. The more the investigators learned about Castellano's operation, the more it became clear that James wasn't the first to disappear like this. Over the years, several others had met untimely ends or vanished without a trace, and some were now suspected to have been silenced for knowing too much, much like James. But the difference in James's case was the car, the Chevrolet Bel Air. It was too big a clue to ignore. Why had his car been hidden in the mine, and why had it been buried with such precision? The detectives returned to the mine, focusing now not just on the car, but on the rest of the tunnel system that had once been used for meetings and covert activities. It wasn't just a burial site. It was a symbol, an intricate part of the larger conspiracy. The mine, with its secretive tunnels, had likely been used for illicit transactions, and it was here that James had crossed the line. He had seen something he shouldn't have, or perhaps he had threatened to expose something that could unravel the entire operation. Through careful investigation, they traced the timing of James's disappearance and cross-referenced it with key mafia activities in Nevada and surrounding states. The closer they got, the more it became clear that Castellano wasn't acting alone. He had worked with other figures, including some from outside Nevada, to ensure that James would never talk. The operation that had orchestrated James's disappearance was far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just about silencing one man. It was about keeping control of a vast criminal network that stretched into nearly every industry across the West Coast. Yet, there was still a significant question that no one had fully addressed. Who had given the final order? Castellano might have been the mastermind, but who had been the one to actually put the plan into motion? The detectives learned that Castellano had a long history of manipulation and coercion, using his gambling empire as a front for larger criminal activities. But even Castellano had to answer to someone. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that this was no longer just about James Turner. It was about the dark and powerful men pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the investigation intensified, they found more disturbing evidence. Secret ledgers and hidden accounts linked Castellano and his associates to several high-profile figures, both in Nevada and in California. These individuals were responsible for laundering money, smuggling goods, and even running illegal arms deals. The operation was like a spider's web, and James had been caught in its tangled threads. The most shocking discovery came when the detectives uncovered a document buried deep within a hidden safe in one of Castellano's properties. It was a ledger of payments, and it listed the names of people who had been involved in James's life leading up to his death. James wasn't just someone who had wandered into the criminal underworld by accident. He had been slowly drawn into it, his small business dealings leading him further down a dangerous path. And the more the detectives learned about those he had interacted with, the more it became apparent that there had been someone working with Castellano, someone close to James who had helped orchestrate the final trap. This new lead pointed them to an unexpected figure, a man named Thomas "Tommy" Malone, a local contractor who had worked with James on various construction projects. Malone had been in regular contact with James in the months leading up to his disappearance, and his name had appeared multiple times in James's notebook. At first, Malone seemed like a peripheral figure, someone who might have just been an acquaintance of James, but the more they dug into his background, the more suspicious his behavior became. Was Malone involved in the criminal operations that had led to James's death? Was he the one who had helped lure James into the trap, or was he simply another pawn in the hands of a much larger network? Malone's involvement was a game-changer. As the detectives began to question him, his nervous demeanor and inconsistent statements raised red flags. The more they pressed, the more he seemed to slip up, as if he knew far more than he was letting on. Eventually, under the pressure of the investigation, Malone admitted to having been involved in the planning of the meeting that James had attended just days before his disappearance, but he claimed that he had been unaware of the full extent of the criminal activity involved. He had simply been used as a middleman, a person who had introduced James to people like Leo Castellano. But how deep did Malone's involvement really go? The detectives were now sure of one thing. James Turner had become collateral damage in a battle far bigger than anything he could have imagined. He had stumbled upon a dangerous world, and when he began to ask the wrong questions, the system he had tried to navigate had closed in on him. He had been silenced because he knew too much, and because there were people willing to kill to protect their interests. As the investigation unfolded, the web of deceit and criminal connections became ever more complicated. Every time the detectives thought they had uncovered a piece of the puzzle, it only led them to a deeper, darker layer. The discovery of Thomas "Tommy" Malone's role in James Turner's death was crucial. Malone had not been just an innocent contractor caught in the crossfire. He had been a part of a much larger operation, a man who had willingly turned a blind eye to the dark world he was being pulled into. Malone's involvement revealed something even more disturbing: the level of collaboration between various criminal figures across Nevada, California, and even as far as Chicago. The network that James had unknowingly stumbled into was vast and far-reaching. It wasn't just about illegal gambling or smuggling, it was an entire underground empire, built on money laundering, protection rackets, and even arms dealing. James had been looking to make a living, and somewhere along the way, he had become entangled in a far more dangerous game. Through the network that was slowly being pieced together, it became clear that the plan to silence James had been meticulous. Leo Castellano, with his wide-reaching influence, had been the architect of it all, but his motivations were still unclear. Why had he gone to such extreme lengths to cover up James's disappearance? Was it because James had gotten too close to exposing illegal dealings, or was there something more personal at play? As the investigators followed the trail of money, they uncovered connections that suggested James had been part of a larger conspiracy. A significant portion of the transactions involved smuggling operations that were running right under the noses of the authorities. James, a man who had never strayed far from a quiet life, had unknowingly become a piece in a much larger puzzle, and when he had started asking questions and showing signs of suspicion, he had become a threat to the entire network. The more the detectives learned about James's last days, the more it became clear that his death had been carefully orchestrated. It wasn't just about silencing him, it was about keeping him from exposing everything he had learned. The mine, with its labyrinth of tunnels, had been the perfect place to hide him and the car. It was a location steeped in secrecy, just the kind of place where a man could be forgotten. Yet, even with all the discoveries, there was still something hauntingly missing. Despite the evidence pointing to Castellano's involvement, the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would explain why James was targeted and by whom, remained elusive. Who had been the final authority behind James's death? Had Castellano acted alone, or had others been involved in giving the orders? The investigation took a crucial turn when they discovered that Leo Castellano had been in contact with several higher-ups in organized crime in California, as well as individuals who had connections to political figures in Nevada. One of the names that surfaced in the investigation was Jimmy "Big Tuna" Caruso, a notorious figure in the Los Angeles crime scene. Caruso had long been rumored to have a hand in many of the operations Castellano was running, though he had never been directly tied to the Nevada operations. The detectives now suspected that Caruso was not just a peripheral player in the story of James Turner's death. He might have been directly involved. The detectives now focused on Caruso's ties to Nevada, specifically to certain businesses that had been under investigation for years. They discovered that Caruso had been investing heavily in legitimate enterprises, businesses that seemed above board on the surface but were actually fronts for money laundering and illegal trafficking. As the web unraveled, it became increasingly clear that James Turner had been an unfortunate casualty of the underworld's desire to keep its empire intact. By retracing Caruso's movements and phone records from the weeks leading up to James's disappearance, the detectives found evidence of a direct line of communication between him and Castellano. It seemed that James had been killed not just because he knew too much, but because he had unknowingly become a threat to an operation that extended far beyond Nevada. Caruso, it turned out, had been using Castellano's gambling empire as a front for smuggling operations that brought contraband into the country. James had gotten too close to uncovering these operations, and it seemed that he had been silenced for that reason alone. The detectives were now certain that Leo Castellano had played a pivotal role in James's death, but Caruso's involvement elevated the case to a new level of complexity. The two men had worked together, using their criminal enterprises as shields while they operated with impunity, hiding their activities behind layers of legitimate businesses. The more they dug, the more the investigators realized that the death of James Turner was just one small piece of a much larger, more dangerous criminal enterprise. Yet even as they connected the dots between Castellano, Caruso, and other high-profile criminals, they couldn't shake the eerie feeling that James Turner had been more than just a victim. He had been someone who had stumbled upon a hidden network, someone who had unknowingly threatened the empire that had been built in the shadows of Nevada. And when he had started to question the dealings around him, when he had started to uncover the truth, he had become expendable. His life had been taken because of the secrets he had uncovered, secrets that no one was willing to let go of. As the investigation reached its climax, the web of deception and danger surrounding James Turner's death continued to unfold with terrifying clarity. With every name uncovered and every connection traced, it became more evident that James had been entangled in a vast criminal conspiracy that extended well beyond the boundaries of Nevada. This wasn't just the story of one man's disappearance. It was the unraveling of an entire criminal empire that had operated in the shadows, manipulating people and institutions for decades. The deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized that James had unknowingly become a crucial threat to this system, a man who had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place as the detectives continued to focus on Leo Castellano and his ties to Jimmy Big Tuna Caruso. Their partnership, which had been previously hidden beneath layers of secrecy, was now at the center of the case. Caruso, it seemed, had used his influence to shield Castellano's operations, while Castellano acted as a local enforcer for larger, more dangerous interests. The two men were involved in an intricate web of crime that spanned not only Nevada, but also California and beyond. The gambling, the smuggling, the money laundering, it all connected back to them. But despite the undeniable evidence of their involvement, there was still something unsettling about the entire operation. The detectives knew that they were closing in on the masterminds behind James's death, but the question remained: was there someone even higher up, someone who had orchestrated this entire scheme from the shadows? Through further investigation, the detectives discovered a chilling connection to a series of high-profile figures who had long been known for their ties to organized crime. These individuals had been involved in the very same operations that James had stumbled upon, and it became increasingly clear that James had been targeted not just for what he knew, but for what he had the potential to expose. He had been silenced because his questions and suspicions had threatened to reveal a web of corruption that reached the highest echelons of society. Among the names that surfaced in the investigation was a wealthy businessman named Richard Dick Thornton, who had been a key financial backer of several legitimate enterprises across Nevada and California. Thornton had invested heavily in casinos, hotels, and shipping companies, all of which had been used as fronts for the illegal operations that Castellano and Caruso were running. Thornton's name had never been directly tied to any criminal activities, but his connections were undeniable. The more the detectives looked into his background, the more they realized that he had been the one pulling many of the strings from behind the scenes. His influence over politicians, law enforcement, and even the media gave him the power to shield men like Castellano and Caruso from the law. James Turner, it seemed, had unwittingly walked into a much larger conspiracy, one that involved not only the criminal underworld, but also respected members of the business and political elite. His death had been the result of a well-coordinated effort to protect these powerful figures and preserve the secrets they had been hiding for years. As the investigators pieced together the connections between these powerful figures, they came to a disturbing conclusion. James Turner had been marked for death not just because of what he knew, but because of what he was about to uncover. The authorities had long been unable to see the full extent of the criminal empire that operated under their noses. James, with his small-town naivety and growing suspicions, had become a casualty of this hidden war, his life snuffed out because he had unknowingly threatened the status quo. With the truth now slowly emerging, the detectives were left to consider the wider implications of their findings. The legacy of James Turner's death was far more than just a tragic case of a missing man. It was the revelation of a criminal network that had flourished for decades, protected by money, power, and fear. And even though the culprits were now known, the vast scale of the corruption meant that bringing them to justice would be a long and dangerous fight. The investigation had exposed the truth, but it had also uncovered something even darker, a criminal empire that had been operating under the radar, manipulating and controlling those who crossed its path. As the Eisenhower case continued to unfold, the detectives knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. But the discovery of James Turner's car and the truth behind his death had shattered the illusion of safety that the criminals had once held. The powerful men who thought they were untouchable now had to face the consequences of their actions. The truth had finally come to light, but whether it would be enough to dismantle the criminal empire was still uncertain. James Turner, a man who had simply wanted a better life, had paid the ultimate price for uncovering a secret that could topple the foundations of organized crime. His story, buried for over 70 years, had finally been told. And in the end, it wasn't just about bringing those responsible to justice. It was about revealing the dark heart of a criminal world that had, for too long, operated without consequence. The mystery of James Turner's disappearance had been solved, but the repercussions of his death would echo through the criminal underworld for years to come. The forces behind his death had been powerful, but now they were being exposed, and while justice may not have come immediately, the truth was finally shining through, forcing a reckoning for those who believed their secrets could stay buried forever.